My next great pleasure is to introduce the next speaker, who is, can I call you Joey?
Yeah.
Okay, I know him as Joey because he's my former student from Bishop Montgomery High School. And look how tall he is. And I want to introduce also Mitchell, who is behind the camera, because he too is my former student from Bishop Montgomery. And they both graduated in 2011. And a third student was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately he doesn't drive yet, so he couldn't make it here. But they're coming in. The young generation is coming in, right, Father? We've got a good number of young people coming to our church because this is what they're hungry for, is to know the historical, spiritual context of what it means to be Catholic Christian in the 21st century, and how to do it effectively, how to live it truly, wisely, and in the world, not just something you do on Sunday, right? And so Joey is a perfect example of this. I mean, he's come a long way since the 10th grade. I was his theology teacher, and I would look around the classroom and ask the students, where is Joey? And they said, I don't know. They don't know where Joey is. And they indicated, look outside in the hallway, he might be there. And so I looked in the hallway. Sure enough, he's down at the very end of the hallway talking, well, to teachers and students, and very social person. So I have to always reel him back in. But I remember Joey being very fond of his theology classes, and so here is testimony to this. Did you know Joey is now wrapping up, what, your second or third master's? Third master's in theology from GTU, Dominican School of Theology?
I'm at the Jesuit school right now.
He switched from Dominican to Jesuit, and now he's got his eye towards, can I say it?
Yeah.
Towards Rome. Pontifical University?
Angelical.
University of Rome, to get his PhD in theology. So he's going to be one of these young people who is going to come back and teach us here at St. Andrew about his topic today is the integration of the 12-step program and its spiritual essence with the early church fathers teaching on ascetical practices. Can you imagine? So, Joey, you're on.
Yeah, the mic, okay.
Oh, what's up?
Can you hear me?
Could somebody help?
Just press the button.
Oh, you pressed the button. Can you hear me now? Oh.
You better push the button.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be here and inviting me in. And yeah, I did want to start with, if people didn't know, that I am a classmate of, she's Miss St. James to me. She still is Miss St. James even in my phone. And thank God for a short memory, because I don't remember how I was in high school, thank God. But I thank you for your patience with me. Yeah, anytime I can do anything for Bishop Montgomery and see, my former classmates and stuff, I do share with people that Bishop Montgomery, is that too loud?
No, that's better.
It's better? Oh, okay. I do share with people that Bishop Montgomery in many ways saved my life. That was a very interesting period in my life, and the teachers had particular patience with me and love for me that I felt even when I pretended I didn't. So thank you for allowing me to be here. Yeah, as it was stated, so my research that I took to the Dominican school where I did my graduate studies was this comparison between the 12-step program and the ascetic disciplines of the Desert Fathers. And I was sitting with my friend Gabriel here these past couple of days, and I thought, how am I going to express to you all why on earth that would be the topic of discussion for today? Why is that my research? And I was starting to think about my life and my exposure to topics like alcohol, drugs, behavioral addictions. And I grew up here, grew up in Southern California, grew up in Los Angeles and Westchester, went to school in Santa Monica, and then graduated by the grace of God from Bishop Montgomery. And I think it's safe to say for everyone in this room, we all know someone, if not ourselves, who has a problem with drugs and alcohol. It's Los Angeles. It just is what it is, unfortunately. And with that, I remember at a certain age, it wasn't uncommon to see my classmates and my peers getting carted off to rehabs and wilderness camps as a preteen, because that's just what we did. And that was one of the first memories trying to present this narrative to you all. The other thing I wanted to share was, and I shared this with my mother yesterday, she was talking about this. I remember distinctly when I was about 13 or 14, I was in the car with her, and she said, you know, you should probably go to Alcoholics Anonymous. What? Why you got me? Why would I go to Alcoholics Anonymous? And she said very clearly, she said, because you probably need to know where you come from. I remember that to this day as being such a pivotal moment in my life, that this is something that affects a lot of people. But the second thing was, there was a place where people go. My mom presented that to me as Alcoholics Anonymous. The final thing I want to share before I get into my actual research was in this preparation, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in 20 years. My first exposure to anything related to 12-step anything I didn't even know was 12-step, and it was a program called ACTheals. I went to an ACTheals meeting in Santa Monica, off Arizona. I took the number 3 big blue skated there, had pink hair, a leather jacket, and all that stuff. And it was a bunch of teenagers talking about their parents or their loved ones who were alcoholics and addicts. I never went back, but I hadn't thought of it in 20 years. My first exposure to some sort of recovery, even if it wasn't me as the individual suffering from that disease. So that influenced my interest in studying this on, if you want to call it, on an academic or even a pastoral level. What I do today outside of school, to just give you a little bit more context before I get into the research, is I attend to, if minister is the right word, I minister to inmates at San Quentin, usually from the Orthodox tradition, because I'm a Melchizedek Catholic, so I come from the Eastern Church. So I visit inmates in San Quentin that tend to have issues with whether it be drugs or alcohol or behavioral issues that they, by their own will, cannot stop. I also bring in, I facilitate meetings at the psychiatric hospital in Oakland for the same reasons. Most people prepare for drug-induced comas or alcoholism as well. And I facilitate a specific 12-step meeting for Orthodox Christians at my home parish called the ACTheals Fellowship. I've spoken to them about the same connection. So you can see why I brought this into an academic world. I had a personal investment in this. My loved one suffered from this disease. So beginning this research, my introduction to the 12-step had nothing to do with Christianity. But what I found over the years, that Alcoholics Anonymous, the founding group of the 12-step program, had a lot of connections to Christianity. A couple I just wanted to express to you. Before the 12-step program existed, if you weren't aware, there was a group called the Oxford Group, founded by American Lutheran Frank Bookman, began to apply these Christian principles to the battle of alcoholism and sin in general, as they saw it, one and the same. This sin that ravaged through the lives of their members from all classes. They lived by a system called the 4 absolutes. They called absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. But it was at these Oxford groups that the pre-founders of what we now understand as Alcoholics Anonymous found some sort of recovery in Christian principles. The main name that people tend to refer to in this research was Eddie Thatcher, who in 1934 was a beacon of hope for the sick and suffering alcoholic and creator of the 12-step program, a household name today, Bill Wilson. Bill was to eventually break off from the Oxford group to begin a society of alcoholics named Alcoholics Anonymous. It was Bill who understood that the endorsement from the Catholic Committee of Publications of New York in 1939 would make or break the fellowship's potential usefulness in their early days after the publication of their basic text, a text from which the fellowship got its name. I wanted to bring that because I tend to hate when people mention books and I just don't know what they're talking about. So I have a copy of the third edition of the big books of Alcoholics Anonymous, if you want. Just pass that around for context. Other names that were very influential to Bill's journey, for example, the Jesuit Father Edward Dowling and Sister Mary Ignatius, continued to provide him and other alcoholics, specifically in hospitalization, with a course of action as it pertained to both this hospitalization physically, but as a practical means of recovery afterward. Dr. Robert Smith, sometimes referred to affectionately as Bob, the other co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, championed the Akron group during AA's what's called flying blind period, before the publication of their big book in 1939. It was referred to sometimes in these meetings that it was indistinguishable from the meaning of Alcoholics Anonymous in a Bible study. Because if you don't have the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, you use Scripture. But coinciding with these innate Christian roots, the 12-step program prides itself as a program that works. Not only in its successful achieving of sobriety, but also in its usage of practical disciplines. Such disciplines are comparable to the disciplines of the early Christian church, specifically to individuals who fled into the desert to wage war with the passions. A necessary struggle if one was to embrace the call of Matthew 5:48. Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. There are a few better examples of the apostolic church's lived dedication to Christian perfection and the redemption of one's life than the discipline of these desert ascetics, the father of which is St. Anthony the Great, the other book I brought for showing time.
I knew I saw that.
I saw some life. So that's the life of Anthony, written by, as Father was talking about, St. Athanasius in the mid-4th century AD. The life of Anthony records the disciplines of Anthony in the Egyptian desert as he attempted to live out that call to Christian perfection. And these ancient disciplines would be familiar to any active member of the 12-step program, revealing the practical compatibility between the 12 steps and the foundational ascetic disciplines of our church. Now, with such a Christian foundation, both in origin and practice, it doesn't take much imagination to see that the glaring discrepancy between the 12-step program and Christianity is their relationship with Jesus Christ. Although comprised of Christian elements, the 12-step program does not require its member to be Christian, nor does it even state that Christianity is the inevitable or essential means for success of obtaining sobriety. The solution posited is complete abandonment of one's own ability to stay sober in favor of reliance upon something else, whose power is sufficient for recovery. Now, this power, with a capital P, is described in the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous by means of a variety of synonyms, but ultimately defined as a self-defined higher power. This approach to the recovery process of alcoholism and addiction has proven to be successful, as if you open up to that book that I passed around, the full title of the book is Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. Here we approach my interest in my research question. If the practical disciplines of the 12-step program are an embodiment of the ascetic disciplines of those desert fathers, why then would someone who has found recovery and sobriety through the 12-step program, essentially who has recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body by means to surrender to a self-defined higher power, ever be compelled to turn to Jesus Christ. In other words, if it works, why change? If it's not broken, why try to fix it? This is the question that I want to answer, and the question that I believe I did when I researched my thesis and my book that I'll be sending to the publisher next month. The book is entitled Lessons from the Tombs, St. Anthony the Great and the 12-Step Program. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the methodology and then really get into the comparison between Anthony and the 12 steps. The first aspect of my book is a comparison between the ascetic disciplines present in the life of Anthony and the practices of the 12-step program, posited as the means for recovery. The specific disciplines under analysis are those of an initial surrender to a higher power, which is the focus of today's talk, followed by imitation, labor, self-examination, and daily effort. My analysis supports the connection of both of these disciplines of Anthony and the practices of the 12-step program that surpasses the program's circumstantial and historical development as it relates to Christianity. In other words, just because it was founded on Christian beliefs and roots doesn't ultimately reveal why I'm arguing that the alcoholic or the addict will eventually turn to Christ. What I argue is that the practices of the 12-step program are a living embodiment of the ascetic disciplines of St. Anthony the Great and in turn of our tradition as Catholics. Now, as far as the methodology is concerned, I found when I discuss this topic, especially with individuals who are not Catholic, who are not Orthodox, who are not in the Christian tradition, that tend to just rely on the 12-step program. The argument goes to the historical foundation. What I take is the pragmatic approach. The comparison established, in other words, the methodology that I use, to address the divergence between the self-defined higher power of the 12-step program and Jesus Christ, is using simply the pragmatic method, which is the testing of the practical consequences of a proposition. If the consequences of a proposition are tested to prove and work to support the good of the individual's practical life, then the proposition contains truth. When it comes to the sobriety of an alcoholic or an addict, such a methodology goes beyond that practical nature. I demonstrate in my book that William James, who is the founder of American Pragmatism, was a huge influence on co-founder Bill Wilson's recovery, as he, in his hospital bed, dying from alcoholism, was given William James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is listed, the only name listed in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is William James, and a reference to his book. Now, a little bit more of the material that I use, because you can obviously imagine there are many different 12-step programs. Those in the medical field obviously know that. Those who work as chaplains know that. But I use, when I talk about the 12-step program, I refer to Alcoholics Anonymous exclusively. There's a couple of reasons why. The first reason is that the text of Alcoholics Anonymous, the book I passed around, is the basic text of the fellowship. This text contains Bill Wilson's creation of and instruction on the 12-step program. Being that the original 12 steps and all further publications approved by Alcoholics Anonymous World Services are consistently represented in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, an exclusive reliance on the material of Alcoholics Anonymous provides consistency as it relates to the goal of my book. This material includes, but is not limited to, public accounts of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous published in their international journal, AA Grapevine, along with personal correspondence that I've made with individuals who have remained, of course, anonymous. Second reason is that the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous, including the 12 steps, has inspired many of the 12-step fellowships to form, all of which confront specific addictions or circumstances for their members. For example, we have Narcotics Anonymous, Al-Anon, I mentioned Alateen, Sex Addicts Anonymous, etc. The final reason is that looking at all of those fellowships, because they address a certain issue, they have themselves produced different literature. But I found a problem with that. When looking at the original solution posited from Alcoholics Anonymous, it is very clear. It's going to be God. There's no way around it. When it came to later publications of the 12 steps, certain groups decided to change certain words. God as we understood him became God as we understood God. A higher power became a higher power or the greater good. You can see how this is different from the 1939 publication of You're going to have to find God. Now, because of this exclusive reliance upon the material of Alcoholics Anonymous, also in referring to the problem in my research, I'm talking about alcohol. But we all know that that's not the only issue that's brought up as an individual tries to find recovery. You stop alcohol, you find food. Stop food, you find sex. No sex, cigarettes. I address alcoholism specifically out of convenience because I'm talking about the big word Alcoholics Anonymous. And regarding the same thing with material for St. Anthony, I refer exclusively to the Black Man. So, with that, I believe I've created enough context. Let's talk about Anthony. Most of us from the Eastern tradition know who that is, refer to St. Anthony the Great. In the West, I believe it's St. Anthony the Hermit. Is that sometime? There's another name usually referred to in the Western tradition, but for me, it's usually St. Anthony the Great. Growing up, he was devoted to comfort. His whole life and desire, as it was written by St. ACTheals, was to live at home, unaffected by the outside world. This dedication to the safe existence of his known world spurred his decision to withdraw from school, wishing to stand apart from the normal activities of children. Although neither a problem child nor an ingrate who hungered for a more lavish existence, Anthony was content with the privileged life he had received from his parents, not interested in anything more than what was already given to him. As St. Athanasius writes, having Christian parents, Anthony was brought up as a Christian, and although a homebody, he would join his parents in church. This was not solely an empty household regulation, for Anthony was an attentive listener to Scripture, keeping, quote, in his heart what was profitable of that. The death of his parents, however, brought new responsibilities to the young man. At this point, he was about 18 to 20 years old, which was the care for a home and a young sister. His comfortable life was now challenged with real-world decisions. Remaining a devout Christian, Anthony was on his way to church when he reflected upon the following. Quote, he reflected upon how the apostles gave up everything and followed the Savior, and how those in Acts sold their possessions and brought them and placed them at the feet of the apostles for the distribution to those in need. He was thinking about what kind of hope was laid up for them in heaven. The life to which Anthony was accustomed up to this point at Christian. The Christian life, represented in his contemplations on the way to church, had revealed a call beyond that with which Anthony was comfortable. Upon arriving at church, Anthony's contemplations were enforced with the gospel read on that day. If you want to be perfect, go, sell all your possessions, and give to the poor, and come follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. Drawing the conclusion that this passage was addressed to Anthony himself for his own sake, he followed the instructions which Christ gave to the rich man. Quote, he immediately left the church, and the possessions he had inherited from his ancestors he freely gave away to the people from his village, so they would not bother him or his sister about anything. He sold all his remaining possessions and, collecting a considerable amount of money, distributed among the poor, keeping a little for his sister. As William Harmless notes, the gospel reading had affected Anthony deeply, for he saw himself in the reading. He was the rich young man to whom Jesus was speaking. Although content with his material life, the Christian life to which he was called was unattainable by familiar means. More would be required of him if he wished to reach Christian perfection. So returning to church, he was given further gospel instruction. Do not be concerned about tomorrow. He was troubled by this, finding unbearable the compromises he had made. So he left and distributed the remaining things among those less well off. His sister he entrusted to well-known and faithful virgins, while from that time on he devoted himself to ascetic discipline in front of his home. That which was once his source of happiness, his sheltered home life, was now the stumbling block he was to reject, embracing the contrary life of the wilderness. The alternative for Anthony, to continue living the way he was living in the comforts of his home, it was no longer an option. When reading these origins of Anthony in the desert, one must be wary of the tendency to see his rejection of material goods and the embrace of an ascetic life as unrelatable, divorced from our 21st century contemporary life. It is easy to view such drastic measures as Anthony felt called to take as unnecessary, even alien to a person whose life can be anything further removed than that of a young, wealthy 3rd century Egyptian man. But setting aside these seemingly foreign external characteristics of Anthony's origins, one appreciates the young man's internal conflict. The tension between the comfortable living of his earthly life and the call to Christian perfection, a perfection to which all Christians, including ourselves, are called. It became clear to Anthony during his contemplation on the Acts of the Apostles that he would not be able to obtain salvation if he were to continue living the way he was. What Anthony came to know was that congenial living, something he admired and adored, and a love of Christ were two opposing principles. Now, while Athanasius reports that Anthony acted immediately upon hearing the first gospel reading, one scholar, David Rodrigues, presents an interesting perspective on Anthony's behavior. Quote, obeying this, the initial call of Matthew 19:21, but keeping a little money on the side from the sale to provide for his sister, he heard once more the gospel. Take no thought of tomorrow. His attempt to safeguard control of his life created unbearable tension. Responding to the gospel, Anthony approached what may be called the jumping off point of self-abandonment, and an actualized and all-encompassing reliance upon God with respect to both the material and eternal dimensions. No longer was he to see his material possessions of any value, delivering himself from earthly comfort and towards harsh living, solely dependent upon God's grace. Both moves, which were up to this point institutionally foreign to Anthony on a practical level. The abandonment of self and of old ways of living in place of an embrace of the care and protection of God is all too familiar to the hopeless alcoholic who has considered the 12-step program as a viable way of living. Just as Anthony's withdrawal from his previous life was neither irrational nor precautionary, but vital and necessary, the recovery of the alcoholic begins with considering the unbearable state in which he finds himself as inescapable and beyond human aid. The gift of salvation from alcoholism is rooted in this desperation and defeat. One, of course, must first be open to the notion that they have, in fact, been defeated. This is the first step in the 12-step program. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. Now, men and women, as Dr. William D. Silkworth writes in his letter to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, thank you, drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. Dave B., author of The Story of Gratitude in Action, confirms Dr. Silkworth's explanation, quote, I became an active alcoholic from that first day, the day of his first drink. When alcohol produced a very special effect, it was transforming. Alcohol was suddenly made me into what I always wanted to be. Quote. The power produced in the alcoholic, once having taken a drink, is that of the supreme source of comfort. As if unaware he had been holding his breath for his entire life, the alcoholic feels that he is able to breathe for the first time. It is a power beyond his own. When embraced, however, the disease of alcoholism embeds into the alcoholic's entire being, affecting both his physical and mental condition. Dr. Silkworth continues that the sensation caused by alcohol is so elusive that while they admit it is injurious, the alcoholic cannot, after a time, differentiate the truth from the false. Similar to Anthony's embrace of comfort constituting the barrier of his salvific journey, Bill Wilson, again the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, includes his reflection on the illusory power of alcohol. Quote, I commenced to forge the weapon that would one day turn in its flight like a boomerang and all but cut me to ribbons. What had once been considered a false god has revealed to be purely false. Nowadays, as you can imagine, nothing about this is easy. It's something that, nor is it something even to be admired, which is represented in the 12 steps and 12 traditions. Quote, who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one, of course. In the chapter more about alcoholism in the big book, the admittance of powerlessness is expressed as anything but acquiescent. Quote, most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think that he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. Upon the discovery of their dilemma, alcoholics will try to prove themselves exceptions to the rule, therefore non-alcoholic. The experimentation of recapturing that sense of power and control yields a myriad of self-imposed tests. Here's a short list. Drinking beer only, limiting the number of drinks. Never drinking alone. Never drinking in the morning. Drinking only at home. Never having it in the house. Never drinking during business hours. Drinking only at parties. Switching from scotch to brandy. Drinking only natural wines. Agreeing to resign if ever drunk on the job. Taking a trip. Not taking a trip. Swearing off forever, with and without a solemn oath. Taking more physical exercise. Reading inspirational books. Going to health farms and sanitariums. Accepting voluntary commitment to asylums. We can increase the list ad infinitum. The disastrous lengths to which an alcoholic is capable of going without admitting complete defeat is adequately described in the story entitled "A 5-Time Loser Wins," found in the 3rd edition of the Alcoholics Anonymous book. Here's a story for that. There are many things worse than dying, but is there any death worse than the progressive, self-induced, slow suicide of a practicing alcoholic? The alcoholic suffers death many times over. Alcohol wrings the guts out of life, eats into the brain in such a way as to make the alcoholic blind to the truth. I served 12 years in prison, never suspecting that without alcohol I wouldn't have been in prison at all. Had it not been for AA in prison, I'll never know, but my educated guess is that I'd probably not be alive today. You see, I'm a 5-time loser, which means 5 felony convictions, not including the case of B. I served time in 4 penitentiaries and several prison camps, including a maximum security camp. The 2 years I spent there, I was incorrigible, and the records bear this out. Also, I was insane at times, according to society's yardstick. But when I cracked my leg with a 16-pound sledgehammer in the rock hole, I was fighting the system, using my body. Same thing when I let lying water eat away at 4 of my toes and my foot for 5 hours. I was an agitator, a troublemaker, and many men as bitter as I was followed me. Intake of alcohol changes one's personality, even the healthy one. If my personality is inadequate, antisocial, or full of kinks, and I alter it with alcohol or any chemical, bingo. There goes my good intentions, my fear of consequences, my will to care, my responsibility for my behavior. What else can I do except what I've always done in the past? It is my old self and return to prison. It must be noted that similar to the difficulty relating to Anthony's situation, and
3rd century Egypt, this individual story does not depict the standard hopelessness of the alcoholic as it pertains to external consequences as a rule. Desperation, as it is made clear in the 12-step program, comes in a variety of shapes and sizes. Alcoholics Anonymous discusses those individuals who have gone not to the same extreme lengths that others have gone to before seeking help. Quote, most of these unfortunate ones have had little or no acquaintance with delirium, with hospitals, with asylums, and with jails. Some were drinking heavily, and there have been occasional serious episodes. But with many, drinking had been little more than a sometimes uncontrollable nuisance. Seldom had any of these lost either health, business, family, or friends. An example of this hopeless kind, whose outer life did not faithfully represent their inner chaos, is seen in the following account. I'm a physician, licensed to practice in a Western state, but I'm also an alcoholic. Yet I may be a little different from other alcoholics. We all hear at AA meetings about those who have lost everything, those who have been in jail, those who have been in prison, those who have lost their families, those who have lost their incomes. Well, I never lost any of it. I never was on Skid Row. I made more money in the last year of my drinking than I made in my whole life. My wife never hinted that she would leave me. Everything that I touched from grammar school on was successful. Mine was the Skid Row of success. The physical Skid Row in any city is miserable. The Skid Row of success is just as good. Both of these accounts, among all those who approach the first step with openness and honesty, have the same thing in common. Each individual had come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as they had been living it. As for Anthony, his defeat began with the contemplation of the Acts of the Apostles and the hope for eternal salvation waiting for those willing to surrender. Now, where Anthony returned was obvious. Arrived at church, Anthony heard his instruction. Father Matthew the Poor illuminates Anthony's temperament as it relates to his surrender. Quote, obedience to the commandment, as understood from the life of Anthony, and as he himself realized, is based on the understanding that it is a divine instruction. St. Anthony brought himself and his entire life to a complete halt for the sake of obeying the Lord's statutes. The love for Christ he received as a youth and the openness to Scripture gave Anthony the direction required for salvation. He was to abandon himself in the embrace of a power that would provide him and that which he would not be capable of achieving on his own terms. The alcoholic's response, however, to powerlessness and unmanageability, although not as defined as alcoholics, points in the same direction: God. The chapter written to those of an agnostic temperament in AA provides a final test for the individual unsure of the nature of their drinking. Quote, if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if from drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably an alcoholic. As a description of the alcoholic up to this point is defined, the curious reader, if of the alcoholic kind, will be left feeling uneasy, as Dr. Silkworth provides his experienced medical opinion. Quote, the general opinion seems to be that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. Having surrendered to the fact that they are bodily and mentally unsound, the 12-step program presents a suggested solution. If that be the case, that you are an alcoholic, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, the term spiritual experience may be defined in a broad manner, stated in the second appendix of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, as a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. It further describes this change as being dependent fundamentally on an awareness of a power greater than themselves, or what, dare I say, quote, their more religious members call God consciousness. What experience had taught the alcoholics of this program was that left to their own devices, the life they had been living would eventually come to a traumatic end. Up to this point, they were on borrowed time. quote, our human resources as marshaled by the will were not sufficient. They failed utterly. With their problem rooted in a lack of power, the solution would require a new power source. Quote, we had to find the power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Although this initial consideration of a higher power, that would be a consideration of a power greater than that willfully produced in the alcoholic, may not be a favorable one. Faced with alcoholic destruction, they stated, we soon became open-minded on spiritual matters as we tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Having been persuaded, therefore, the alcoholic reached step 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Anthony's faith in the redemption of his soul had already been firmly planted by hearing Christ's gospel from his childhood. For the alcoholic, this reality cannot be assumed. Once, however, the alcoholic embraces the fact that reliance upon something bigger than him is the only solution to the disease of alcoholism, he is able to see that recovery is possible, as stated in Alcoholics Anonymous' 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he were sought. Being convinced, we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood it. This decision is not a thought process, but an actualized change in perception. The alcoholic asks himself, what would my life look like if I were to abandon myself to God as I understood it? For Anthony, the answer to this question was clearly given to him in Scripture. If you want to be perfect, go, sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and come follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. For the alcoholic, the answer is of the same severity as the popular adage of the 12-step program states. There is only one thing you have to change, and that one thing is everything. This decision may be a simple effort in attending a 12-step meeting, as stating one's name and disease. For example, my name is, and I'm an alcoholic. For others, the initial decision may be an entire upheaval of the alcoholic's life. It even may be appropriate for some cases to seek medical attention, as stated in the doctor's opinion. Quote, though we work out our solution on the spiritual as well as an altruistic plane, we favor hospitalization for the alcoholic who is very jittery and befogged. In either case, the alcoholic has made a decision. That decision is to quit playing God, to admit that he no longer has a viable plan for living a sustainable life, and is willing to consider any option not of his own design. The response to the call of Christian perfection in Anthony was conducted with this same severity that alcoholics' call is to sobriety. It is the drastic measure which the alcoholic is willing to undergo in order to save his own life and recover from alcoholism that mirrors the severity of Anthony's exercise in order to save his own soul. That the call to Christian perfection for Anthony was quite literally a matter of life and death. Now, in my research, what I tend to do at this point is to lead specifically into some of the exercises, because this retreat focuses more on surrender. What I want to just close with as a reflection was something that I heard the last time I presented this material. Last year I went to a retreat, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion in Mundelein, St. Mary of the Lake. And they wanted me to read the first chapter, which is essentially what I did today. At the end, there was a Q&A, and a priest asked me, he was an OCA priest, and he said, you know, I noticed you say that the alcoholic is on borrowed time. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, aren't we all? And I said, exactly. That's my point. Although I'm making a reflection about a specific case, Anthony in the 3rd century, and an alcoholic, what I wanted, as I said to the priest, subliminally to get across is what is this saying about my own life? And it reminded me, because when I come in town, I don't live in this area anymore, I live in the Bay Area. My wife and I just moved from Oakland to Berkeley. I get to come here usually for Matins, if you didn't know. There's a prayer service every Wednesday and Friday at 8 a.m. right here. And during this service in the Orthodox in the East, it begins usually with 6 psalms. And there's a beautiful section. I'm just going to read to you from Psalm 62. O God, thou art my God. I seek thee. My soul thirsts for thee. My flesh faints for thee as in a dry and weary land where no water is. So I looked upon thee in the sanctuary, beholding thy power and glory. Because thy steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise thee. So I will bless thee as long as I live, and I will lift up my hands and call on thy name. Beautiful. But do I mean it? I mean, I show up, right? I show up to have my prayer corner when I do Orthodox at home. I show up with Luna and with Gabriel. Do I mean these words, or am I just repeating what I've been taught to say? I don't think that it's a coincidence that the following psalm read during the Orthodox service is as follows. O Lord my God, I call for help by day. I cry out in the night before thee. Let my prayer come before thee. Incline thine ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am reckoned among those who go down to the pit. I am like a man who has no strength, like one forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom thou dost remember no more, for they are cut off from thy hand. Thou hast cast me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Thy wrath lies heavy upon me, and thou dost overwhelm me with all thy ways. Thou hast caused my companions to shun me. Thou hast made me a thing of horror to them. I am shut in so I cannot escape. My eyes grow dim through sorrow. Every day I call upon thee, O Lord. I spread out my hands to thee. Dost thou work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise thee? Is thy steadfast love declared in the grave, or thy faithfulness in Abaddon? Are thy wonders known in the darkness, or thy saving help in the land of forgetfulness? But I, O Lord, cry to thee. In the morning my prayer comes before thee. Why dost thou cast me off? Why dost thou hide thy face from me? Afflicted and close to death from my youth up, I suffer thy terrors, I am helpless. Thy wrath is swept over me, thy dread assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long, they close in upon me together. Thou hast caused lover and friend to shun me, my companions are in the darkness. As a dear friend once told me, it takes the chaos of one's life to find the courage to flee to the desert. Now this flight, of course, is the move towards Christian perfection. But what does that even mean? I've said that in the book, I've said that today, I've read it in scripture. What does it mean when I say Christian perfection? Because it sounds nice, it really does. I wish I could just say that and walk off. But the best description that I found is in St. Nicodemus' work, Unseen Warfare. There's a quick quote here. The greatest and most perfect thing a man may desire to attain is to come near to God and dwell in union with Him. After learning what constitutes Christian perfection and realizing that to achieve it, you must wage a constant cruel war with yourself, you really desire to be victorious in this unseen warfare and be rewarded with a crown, you must plant in your heart the following. Never rely on yourself for anything. Bear always in your heart a perfect and all-daring trust in God alone. Strive without ceasing and remain constantly in prayer. This is the challenge that I must be presented every day. And the challenge, if I dare to do today, is to present to you all. What is blocking me from this union with God? If I'm called to bear my cross and to follow Christ to over God, do I know what I'm talking about? What does my cross, and in turn, as was mentioned before, the key to my salvation look like? Have I studied the cross's grains and knots? And furthermore, and probably the most difficult question for me, do I even want to be healed? Because, ladies and gentlemen, I have a sneaking suspicion it's not going to be what I thought. It's not going to be what I thought it looked like. See, for Anthony and the alcoholic, they didn't have a choice. Do I? Is there a way out of this? Can I find a way of half measures? Pretend to be a part of this and just look good in front of me? Or am I going to have to humble myself? What does humbling myself look like? This is how I discovered my own life, that freedom is not getting to do what I want when I want without repercussions, but the opportunity to embrace the life God has called me to live on His terms, whatever the outcome may be. A quick story before I end it. I was leading something at this psychiatric hospital in Oakland, and it was a young lady. She smoked rock, and she wasn't doing well. She wasn't quite there, but she was starting to come out of it a little bit. She'd been there for a couple of days, and she looked at me and gave me such an interesting question I'd never been faced with before. It had to do with her addiction. She said, "When is enough enough?" Again, as I expressed, I like to look good. I don't like to actually do the work. So this was a question that caught me off guard. I had never been approached with that type of question. And at that moment, as I've been trained to do, I let the Spirit work through me in a way that I'm not saying anything original here that comes from me. And I said to her, when you realize in either case you're going to have to die. It just depends on how you want to die. Do you want to die to your ego, or do you want to die smoking rock and dope? But you're going to have to die. And of course, she broke. And I broke, because I realized what that meant in my own life. To be healed, I'm not going to understand what that means. It's going to happen beyond my control, beyond my plan, beyond my design. It's going to require trust. It's going to require faith. Not just, I know who Christ is, but here I am. So what is surrender? What does it look like for me today? And what am I willing to let die in order that I might live in Christ? If that is in fact how I want to live. So thank you for that share.
Wow. Thank you, Joey. This really sets us up very well for the next two sessions. This sets us up for the next two sessions, which is the panel speakers and then the healing service. And one takeaway that I take from Joey's talk is the metaphor he used of breath. That the alcohol gave the person the ability to let go and breathe. And for me, this was an image of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit of the living God, breathe your life upon me. And that breath is a life saver. It's just not an operation of the lungs. It's something that embraces the mind and the spirit, the breath of God. The same breath that was breathed into Adam, formed out of the earth, and made Adam and Eve a living being. This is what makes us spiritually alive, is the ability to breathe in the life of the Spirit and to be set free from the grip of the ego
And so I think, Joey, you addressed very well the whole Christian theology of participating in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus on a daily basis. And it's our fundamental theology of salvation. It's not just something we observe somebody else doing for us, it's something we participate in. And so something does hold us all back from that total surrender. And today I think our prayer service, Lori and the prayer team here to assist us will help us perhaps with the Spirit of the living God to let go of that which we continue to cling to, or it clings to us, to keep us from expanding, from growing, from releasing our life from trauma, from fears, from the small self or the ego-driven self, and dare to become the person who we are, made in the image and likeness of God. That's beyond any of our comprehension. It's not something we can conceive. It is beyond conception. It is our existence. It's a presence, a way of being in this world. And so that is the challenge. And we're lucky because God is in the driver's seat, right?